Also, the tricky part with raised beds is that we've got to get that mainline tubing to the top of these beds here. It's not. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a fantastic day. It is Thursday, October 2nd here in South Georgia, and on today's video we're going to be talking about watering, specifically raised bed watering. So we've been getting a lot of questions lately about irrigation setup for raised beds, how to do it, how long to run it, how often to run it. So we're going to try to answer all that today. And yes, it's very windy out here today, but it's supposed to be windy again tomorrow and the next day. I do have one of those little wind screens on my microphone, but sometimes that doesn't help. So hopefully you'll still be able to hear me. So let's jump right in and talk about the basics. The basics of any home garden drip irrigation setup are going to be this. You're going to have a filter, which you see right there. You're going to have a pressure regulator, which is that white piece you see right there. And then you're going to have this main line tubing here, the supply line, which is going to feed your drip tape or your drip tubing, whatever you're using. So your water goes from the water hose through the filter, through the pressure regulator, and then through this network of mainline tubing. Now in an in-ground garden plot, the mainline tubing will be usually very simple. In a raised bed plot like this, it's a little more complex because we want it to be able to feed all these beds or water all these beds at one time. Also, the tricky part with raised beds is that we've got to get that mainline tubing to the top of these beds here. It's not doing us any good at ground level. We've got to get it up here to the top. And that is definitely the most difficult part of installing a raised bed irrigation system. Figuring out your skeleton of mainline tubing or supply line you're going to have, and then how you're going to get it to the top of those beds. Now, as you might imagine, it's way easier to put all this in place before you set your raised beds or build your raised beds and before you fill your raised beds, but not everybody thinks about it when they're putting together a raised bed garden. A lot of people don't think about it until after the fact, after they've been out there hand watering those beds every day, and they think, man, this would be a lot easier if I had an automated irrigation system. So we put all our main line in place before we put these beds in place. You can see it tees off right there past my pressure regulator, and that main line runs the entire width of this plot all the way to that end and all the way to that end. And then where each row of these raised beds starts, so for all 4 rows, that main line tubing tees off there, and I made a little trench that I knew was going to run right down the center of where those beds were going to sit. And so we have mainline tubing running that way as well. I scratched away some of this mulch here so you could see that. So after we had that mainline network in place, we then set these beds where we wanted them along those rows, but I didn't fill them yet. We left them empty because I wanted my risers here to be inside the bed, not on the outside of the bed. Now obviously, if your beds are already in place and already filled with soil, it's going to be pretty impossible to run those risers on the inside of the bed like I've done right here. You could maybe pull away some soil to do it, but it would be a lot of work. Now personally, just my opinion, I do think it looks a lot better to be on the inside of the bed versus the outside, but not everybody's thinking about that when they're putting raised beds together. But if you're going to run it on the outside, you probably need some way to attach it to the bed. Maybe not as easy to do with these metal beds here as it would be a wooden bed where you might could just staple it onto the wood there to hold it in place. So just something to think about if you're going to run those risers on the outside of the bed, how to get them to stay in place and not be wiggling all over the place. Now when I was designing my setup, I chose for my risers to come up right in the dead center of every bed. You could also have the riser come up in the corner of the bed there if you wanted. Now having it come up in the center of the bed and with this valve setup I've got here, there is a little bit of wasted space right there, about 6 inches of wasted space. Some people, that will drive absolutely crazy, that little bit of wasted space. But I can promise you, I haven't missed it at all now 4 years in on these raised beds here. It's not that much space compared to how much other space we have in this bed here. Pretty negligible in my opinion. But if you didn't want that wasted space, you could point your elbow there more towards that way, towards the side of the bed. Still put a valve in there. You might have to have a few more fittings to kind of configure things so you didn't have this wasted space here. I didn't mind the extra wasted space, that's why I did it the way I did it. Now those valves that I'm using to shut off each bed are not an absolute necessity. You can still have a drip irrigation system without those. And like I said, they do create a little bit of wasted space, but in my opinion, they are an absolute necessity. I couldn't imagine not having valves on these beds here. I like the ability to turn one off when I'm not using it or I don't have anything growing in it at the moment. Those valves also allow me the ability to pull out this entire setup right here, so tape, tubing, and all, while some of these other beds are being watered. So if I'm watering these other beds here, maybe I need to work in this bed here, maybe I need to scratch around that soil a little bit, maybe I need to put more soil in it. If I didn't have that valve there and I pulled all this off, I would just have water gushing out of that elbow there. But that valve allows me to shut it off and pull the rest of the stuff out of there in one piece, do what I need to do, and put it right back. So we covered everything up to the drip tubing or the drip tape, which is going to provide the actual water for your beds or your plants. So now let's compare drip tubing versus drip tape a little bit. So this is drip tubing right here, this brown stuff, and you can get it in several different colors, I believe. Drip tubing is a little easier to install than drip tape because you don't have any screw-on fittings or anything like that. You just pop it right into the mainline tubing. So that fitting just pushes onto the drip tubing and then you push it into the mainline tubing. And a lot of people like this stuff because it's flexible. You don't have to run it in a straight line. You can curve it and twist it all around the bed however you would like and just pin it down where you need to with staples. And so I really like it for these round beds. It wouldn't make much sense to have a bunch of different short drip tape lines coming off that main line there. It makes a lot more sense to use drip tubing in this situation right here, and this works perfect for me. But in our larger beds here, I tend to use more drip tape. Drip tape, you have to run it in a straight line. Most of the time, that's what we're planting in these larger beds. We're planting straight rows of stuff, and the drip tape does lay flat a lot better than the drip tubing does. You got a stretch of drip tubing this long, you're probably going to need quite a few staples to hold it in place. With the drip tape, we just put one staple on the end, and it's fine. And I use a lot of drip tape in my in-ground garden plot, so I always have it on hand. That's probably another reason why I find myself using a lot more drip tape than drip tubing in these beds here. I bought drip tubing one time to put together those spider setups for those round raised beds, and I really haven't needed to buy any more. So if you plant in straight lines or typically plant in straight rows, then you may be more of a drip tape person. If you like to wind things around and do all kind of crazy configurations, drip tubing is probably the best way to go. Now let's talk about how many lines you need per bed. You can see this bed has 2 lines. That other taller bed right there has 3 lines. And that bed down there that's got a leak that I need to fix has 4 lines. And keep in mind here, as we'll discuss more in a minute, with these raised beds, we're never really worried about too much water because this soil drains so well. But what we are worried about is not having enough water. So if I were to recommend just a basic setup in all your beds that were 4 foot wide like this, I would do 4 rows like we see here. But over the years, as I've planted real specific stuff in these beds, for whatever reason, I've switched it up a little bit. So you can see I've got 2 lines real close together here, one farther apart right there. But like I said, if I were just going to do one setup across the board, I would do it like that. And I think it has a lot to do with what you're going to be planting. So if I were to take one of those 4 foot wide beds and I was going to stack it full of carrots, plant them really thick, I would definitely want 4 lines of drip tape. But in this bed right here that only has 2 lines, I could probably still get away with planting 4 rows of cabbage in this bed right here. I may have to hand water a little bit after I put those cabbage plugs in the ground, but these 2 lines are still going to put out plenty enough water to keep everything in here happy. So depending on what you're planting, depending on what your plant spacing is, you may be fine with 2 lines, or you may need 4 like we have over there. And in these more narrow 2 foot wide beds like this one, 2 lines is plenty. I can't ever see a situation where I would need 3 lines in a bed like this. You might get away with 1 line, no more than 2 though. Now let's talk a little bit about when you need to water, how long you need to water, and how often you need to water. So if I direct seed something in these raised beds, like some mustard green seeds or some carrot seeds, I'm not going to rely solely on that drip irrigation system to get those seeds up and germinated. I'm going to give them a splash of water, usually every day for the first, say, 5 to 7 days after I planted, or until I get a good stand coming up there. I want to give them some overhead water, get those seeds germinated, then we can rely on the drip irrigation. And occasionally with transplants, I still have to overhead water them a little bit right after planting before I can rely solely on that drip irrigation. Those cauliflower plugs I put in just a few days ago. It's a little warm out here today. I came out here earlier and they were looking a little pitiful, so I give them a little splash of overhead water to cool them off. Once they get some roots established in that bed there, the drip will keep them plenty happy. Now, if you're only overhead watering your garden with a sprinkler or something like that, there are better times in the day to do something like that. You typically don't want to do it in the middle of the day, in the heat of the day, because you're going to be wasting a lot of water. But if you're using a drip system like we have here, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter when you run it. Now, remember what I said earlier, these raised beds, we're not worried about them getting too wet. They drain really, really well. We're worried about them not having enough water. So I water mine throughout the night. So I'll come out here before I go to bed, 10:30, 11 o'clock, and I'll turn the water on all these raised beds here. And then in the morning when I go take the boys to school, I'll turn it off. That's probably more water than they need, but I'm not worried about too much water. I'm worried about not enough water. During the day, that's when I'm watering some of my other plots around here that I only want to water for a certain period of time, because I am worried about too much water in those in-ground plots. So just for my schedule, it works out better to turn the raised bed irrigation on late at night, turn it off in the morning, and everything's happy. And assuming no rainfall, I'm probably going to do that every 2 or 3 days. That can vary with the seasons. You know, as it cools down, we may not need to do it as often, but in the really hot part of the year, definitely every 2 or 3 days. So that's our setup and how we use it. As always, there's more than one way to skin a cat. That's not the only way to set up drip irrigation on a raised bed, but that's the way we did it. And 4 years later, I'm still really, really happy with it. And if you need specific links to some of these pieces that we used in our setup here, in the video description below, we've got links to several blogs on our website where we break down our setup piece by piece so you can get exactly what you need. And if you have a raised bed irrigation setup that you really like, but it's different than mine, please do share the details in the comments below. That way other viewers can see that and kind of figure out the way they want to do theirs. And if you want to go back in time and see how we set up all that main line before we set these beds in place, watch this video right here and we'll show you how we did that so we got everything nice and neat and straight. So check that out. We'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.